Hi, Courage here. We're going to start with the back of this blazer, and as you can see, the fabric is already placed on fold. So what I'm doing now is measuring out the full length of the blazer, which is 28. That's the length at the back. So I'm going to mark that all out, and then we can begin the process of drafting the blazer. Now that that is marked out, the next thing I'm going to be marking out is the dart distance. So the distance from one dart to another. I'm actually going to be doing a full length dart from the neck all the way down to the end of the blazer. So that's what I'm marking out now. I'm working with 4 inches. 4 inches is not a standard. The reason why I'm using 4 inches is because the client's waist is 30 inches. Now, if you divide 30 inches by 4, which you normally do when you want to cut your waistline, you have 7.5. You divide that 7.5 again by 2 this time, you have 3.75. That 3.75 plus quarter-inch sewing allowance will give you 4 inches. So that was how I got to 4 inches. Next, I'm marking out the dart size. The dart size for this particular outfit is 2 inches. That is what I'm marking out there. Now, how did I arrive at 2 inches? What I did was to subtract the waist from the hip. The hip of this particular person is 39. So 39 minus 30 will give us what? 9 inches. You divide 9 inches into 2. You have 4.5 inches. Take out the half and then work with just 4 inches. If you divide that into 2, you have 2 inches. And that is what I'm using as the dart size. Next is the armhole line. Now for the armhole line, I'm going to do shoulder to armhole plus 1.5 inches. That gives me 10. And then shoulder to the waistline plus a quarter, that is 15.25, which is what I'm marking there. Next is the marking out of the hip line. Now this person's hip length is 8 inches. So from the waistline, I am marking out 8 inches for the hip line. Now on this hip line, the dart size is split into 2. So instead of 2 inches, at the 1 inch mark, you're going to mark on the hip line and then connect it to the waistline, just like you would do a dart. So I repeated the same process at the bottom. That's at the bottom of the blazer. It's out of the frame right now, but what I'm doing there is I'm dividing the same 2 inches into 2 parts and then I connect it with a straight line. Now over to the waistline. What we have is 7.5 by division, but you add that 2 inches, then you have 9.5. Add your sewing allowance for joining them, and then you have 10, and then plus your sewing allowance at the side, you have 10.5. Over to the hip line. Now the person's hip after division is 10 inches. Allowance for sewing that together is half, then half-inch sewing allowance by the side, and you have 11. For the bottom of the blazer, I used the exact same measurements and marked. For the bust line, after division is 9.25. You add what was here, it becomes 11.25. You add half-inch for joining, it becomes 11.75, and then you add half-inch for the side, and then you have 12.25. All I'm doing now is connect all the points from bust to waist to hip and then down to the end of the blazer. Oh yeah, I decided to make the hip line a bit free, so I added an extra half-inch. So that instead of having 40 inches on the hip, we now have 42 inches. A decision I later regretted. So you can just stick to the client's actual measurements. Actual measurements. But if you want to make it freer, then yes, please go ahead and add extra to the measurement. I am not cutting out the armhole yet, so I'm just going to connect from the shoulder to where we marked the armhole line. That's all. At this point, I just cut through all the important seam lines. That's the hip line, the waistline, the bust line, and then the connection to the shoulder. I am not cutting out the darts yet until this is on the lining so that I can cut everything together. Okay, so right now I'm setting up the lining so that I can transfer everything I have done on the fabric to the lining and then cut through the dart that has been marked. The lining, however, is 1.5 inch shorter than the fabric. You will notice if you watch carefully in the video that the lining is shorter by 1.5 inch. Now that I have an identical version on the lining, though shorter, I must repeat again, the lining is shorter, I am now going to cut out the dart. So the whole detail for the dart is going to be cut together. Take note that at each important point, I notch on both sides. So you notch on the right and on the left. Can you see? It's very, very important that you take note of those points. I'm still going to notch for the other side. That's what I mean by right and left. So on the other side, as you watch, you see that when I cut it, I'll also notch all the important points. It helps you make sure that your pieces fit exactly. And when they fit exactly, you have a neater finish because everything is properly aligned. So please notch. Still notching, very important. I'm notching again so that I can notch the lining as well, so that the lining is also marked at all the important points. Now I'm notching the center so that I can know where the center is. I'm also notching the bottom on both the fabric and the lining so that I know where the centers are. Now that this is all set, I am ready to go to the sewing machine and put the pieces together, and that is exactly what I'm going to do. So please just watch carefully. Take note of how I put the pieces together and how important it is to make sure that your seam allowance is neat, that it is even. So if you are going with 1/4 inch, you go with 1/4 inch all the way. Just watch carefully and see how I put all the pieces together. After putting the back pieces together, it's time to draft out the neckline and the armhole line. So just watch carefully and see how I do that. Notice how I make sure that the back pieces are lining up, both the lining and the fabric. Like, I take a lot of time making sure that they match, so that I do not cut the neckline or the armhole and then it's taking a different position on maybe the lining on the fabric. So you have to be extra careful. The beauty of knit finishing is in how careful you are with your cutting, with your sewing, with every single detail. If you pay attention to every little detail and you put all the pieces and everything together, everything will come together perfectly. You may have noticed that I slanted the shoulder down by 1 inch. Now that is generally what I would do if I'm cutting irregular bodice. But for a blazer, I use 1.5 inch. As you will notice later, I will add that 1.5 inch. That is, I am still going to slant it down by extra half inch. Can you see it? So it's 1.5 inch. That's what you use if you want your blazer to sit properly. You will also notice that from the slant, that's from that shoulder end to the under of the armhole, for this particular blazer is about 8.5. Remember, we took 10 for everything. The actual armhole depth was 8.5, and then I left 1.5 for the slanting of the shoulder. Now it varies by client. There are certain clients I will do this for, or there are bigger sizes of people that I will do this for, that I might go for 9, sometimes even 10, because your blazer sleeve should not be tight fitting. It should be loose. If it is tight, you have ugly wrinkles around the armpit, and it's tacky, it's not classy, it's not neat, it's not beautiful looking. So instead of using the regular 7 for armhole depth, you should go for my stumbling over my words. You should go for 8.5 and above. So you can do 9, you can do 9.5, you can even go as high as 10, depending on how big the client or the person is. Okay, over to the front. Now the front is going to be longer than the back. That's because the measurement we are using, the person that has this blazer is busty, so her front waist length is longer than her back waist length by 2 inches. So the back of the blazer is 28 and the front is 30. Next, I'm adding 1.5 as the overlap, but there is no overlap per se for this blazer. As you would have noticed on the cover picture, the front part doesn't even meet. There is a bow in the center, so they don't even meet. But we need it because there's going to be a twist at the bottom of the blazer. You can refer to the cover picture again. At the bottom of the blazer, there's a twist, so that's the extra I'm adding this for, not really for an overlap per se. Okay, now I'm marking out the shoulder line. That's 8.25 inch, and then the same 10 inches I took from the shoulder line to the armhole line. The bust measurement divided by 2 is what I'm taking there, plus ½ inch sewing allowance. Now I normally would not do this on the armhole line, but the bust of the blazer is going to be open, so I want that effect, and that's why I'm taking it on the armhole line. Now what I'm doing there is I'm slanting the shoulder, same neck width, same shoulder slant. 3 inches is the neck width I'm using and I've been using, and then 1.5 inch is what I'm using to slant it down. Then I'm marking out my across chest line. If you follow my Telegram classes, you already know what that is. And on that point, I'm marking out the across chest. So you curve from there, connect to the shoulder line, and you have your armhole circle for the front. Next is the front waist length. Remember I said it is 2 inches longer, so what we have there is 17.25. The back was 15.25. What we have here is 17.25. That's what I've marked out, and then I'll be measuring the waistline on that line I just marked. Next, divide the waist circle by 8 and then mark whatever you get on that point. Next, measure and mark the bust point, that is shoulder to nipple or bust height. Remember to add your sewing allowance from the top, so I actually added 1/4 inch to the actual bust height, and that gave me 10.75. Then I'm marking the same thing I marked on the waistline on the bust line, and then connect it together. From the across chest line, connect with a curve to the bust point. Front waist length minus back waist length is 2 inches. That's what I'm marking out. I will now be adding my sewing allowance of 1/4 inch to each side. Once that is done, I'll connect this new line to the bust point and this other line to the bust point with a curve. Next thing is to mark out the waist circle on the waistline. Waist circle divided by 4 first, and then the sewing allowance we use to join this princess cut, and then your sewing allowance on the side, and you mark. Also add extra on the bust line to accommodate the princess cut, and then connect to the waistline. Next, I'm going to make sure that the princess cut lines are equal from the waist. So if any one is short, I'm going to extend the other one to complete it. So this is shorter, so I'm going to extend it so that it's up to the same length as the other one, and then connect it to the armhole circle. Once again, I have to make sure that I still have the same length. So I measured the original, and then I'm going to extend the new line so that it's the same length as the other armhole we had before. Okay, so next I'll be marking out the hip line. That is 8 inches from the waistline. So from waist to hip is 8 inches, and that's what I'm marking out. Then on that point, I am going to measure out the hip circle plus sewing allowance. Then I'm having it connected to the waistline as well. And then the same measurement I took on the hip line, I'm going to measure it at the bottom of the blazer. So from that point, it's just a straight line. Next, I extended the princess cut line down by 5 inches. I usually do this based on preference or where I want a pocket, a welt pocket to start. So there is no rule to this. You can go higher, you can go lower, depending on the look you're going for. Now it's cut all the way. So I'm actually not going to be cutting out the princess cut line yet, because I want to cut it together with the lining. And I will actually be using the fabric as the lining. That's something I generally do for blazers. It's not compulsory, and sometimes if I don't have enough fabric, I do it part way. So I have the fabric as a lining to a point, and then use actual lining from another point. Maybe in another video I'll show you how I do that. But for this one, the lining is going to be exactly the fabric. I was very wasteful with the fabric here, and I'm going to regret it later. So please be more careful when folding your fabric so you don't waste too much from the sides. So yeah, I'm going to take this now and I am going to cut it on the fabric. That is, I'm going to be creating a lining for this, but from still the fabric. I've said that so many times, right? Okay, so once that is done, that's when I'm going to actually cut out the princess line. But before then, before I forget, we're marking out the neckline. So from that 3-inch point all the way to the end of the extra we added, that's what I'm marking out. So from the neckline that was marked to the end of the blazer, just like you're seeing it, mark it out, and then I'm going to cut it. Just folding it now to show you what it will look like. That's why I have that extra. You'll see as we go further why I have that extra and why we're going to have to fold it that way. That will see later, so don't worry about it yet. Now I'm cutting this out and we're going to proceed to the fabric we're working with. Now all I'm doing is cut another copy on another fabric, and just like I did with the back, I'm just going to cut the borders first, and when I have them stacked on top of each other, I'll now cut the princess cut line. All I'm doing now is mark out the back so that I don't mix up the back of the fabric with the front of the fabric. And then is one thing I forgot to do, and that is notch the important point. So I'm rearranging the fabric so that I can notch the waistline, and it guides me when I'm joining the princess cut.